Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day.
What a cultural issue. Anyway.
My name's Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and we're glad to have with us today Daniel Darling. Daniel's the director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Seminary, and he's the host of the popular podcast, The Way Home. Daniel served in churches in Illinois and Tennessee, and he's also a best-selling author of several books, including The Original Jesus, The Dignity Revolution, and A Way with Words, using our online conversations for good. But before we hear from Daniel, let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center.
Oh, we're going to have a conversation today. I've known Dan for a long time. I never called him Daniel before, but we can call him that. That's Daniel. Anyway, so we're going to talk some about social media, about how pastors and church leaders should address kind of church members who go, I don't know how to describe it, rogue on social media. I also want to talk about Dan has written books, The Dignity Revolution, A Way with Words, and I want to specifically sort of press in on the question of winsome. I've heard winsome's not going to work anymore. I've heard we moved away from winsome. We're done with winsome. So we got lots of conversation to have with Dan Darling. I think you'll find it helpful. We want to remind you can check out extended portions of some of our interviews at ChurchLeaders.com/plus. And if you're enjoying the interviews, and I know you do, people tell me, oh, this is a podcast, I love this, but they don't leave reviews. But reviews are how other people find this. So thank you for listening. And if you're listening, this is your opportunity to put a review, unless you don't like Dan Darling, and then do the review in the next episode. All right, let's move on. So, all right, we're talking about using online conversations for good. Not an easy thing. So let's talk a little bit about how to, because it seems that it just goes quickly. It's not long before someone's using, Hitler, or someone's calling someone a Nazi. And it seems like every social media disagreement leads to disparagement and disruption in relationships. So what would you say to people who believe such discussions are just not held in line at all, just better held in person?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the conversation. I mean, I think on the one level, social media is where a lot of the conversation's happening. And as much as maybe we'd like to, we're not going to go back to the 1950s. We're not going to suddenly all become Amish. So we have to figure out, how do we engage? How do we live in this digital age? How do we conduct ourselves well? So I do think Christians should be engaged in the sort of marketplace of ideas where things are happening. On the other hand, I do think there are some conversations best left offline. There are some conflicts to be resolved that can't be resolved in public. I think one of the things we forget when we're online is that we're in public, especially leaders. Let's say a leader has, I always tell people this. Let's say he only has 100 friends or followers, which is fairly easy to do. Imagine a room of 100 people and you're given the mic. What would you say? And if you're having a conversation, everyone's listening. Or if you have 1,000, that's a pretty big auditorium, and or 10,000. Some have 100,000. That's like the Rose Bowl. You're in public and people are watching you. So as a leader, I think you have to think through not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it, because people are watching you. And the thing with leadership is that people will do in excess what leaders do in moderation. So we're modeling for the people watching us how to conduct ourselves. And so I think we have to think about all those things when we engage in these spaces.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about it. I'm actually on your social media right now. And of course, this is pre-recorded. It's not a live program. So this is from your social media days ago, depending on when we release this. You actually just called out deliberate disinformation from President Biden when he talked about, he did give some misinformation about Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. You told someone happy birthday. You talked about, do we really want Supreme Court justices harassed at restaurants? Now, our audience is pastors and church leaders. You and I are public commentators. Mm-hmm. So what would your advice be to tweet like you? I mean, you've seen my tweets. I comment on things similar to the way you do. I think we share a lot in common. Or what advice would you give to them who are not public commentators, but are pastors and church leaders, probably of local congregations?
I think you have to ask yourself what your calling is. If you're in a sort of national public role, for me, I write columns and, contribute in the public discourse. So I probably comment on a lot of things in the public square that maybe other people wouldn't. And that's okay. I think the demand and pressure that every pastor has to have an opinion on every single current event on the medium that I think they should have is really unfair, right? you have to decide what is your calling. And sometimes I think pastors and church leaders, if they're too active on social, it might have people wonder, are they doing anything else? Like, do they have, are they leading their family? What are they doing? And even those of us who are in the public square, who are commenting on some of these issues, we do have to do this in a way that I think is honoring. I think you can have hard words and prophetic words, but also do it with civility and not demean people. So I disagree, obviously, with President Biden on a number of issues, abortion being one of them. I try not to ever diminish and disparage him personally. And if there are places where I can commend him, like, he gave a Medal of Honor posthumously to John McCain yesterday. I thought that was cool. That was great. I mean, I just think we have to be consistent and try to call out both sides. So when Trump was president, a lot of people called out rightly, when he would say things that weren't true. I think we have to do that for the president too. So I think
but it's interesting. When you or I say something, I still remember one time I was talking about President Obama had done, this was early on in my social media engagement. President Obama had started an initiative, I think it was a fatherhood initiative, was talking about his own relationship with his daughters. And I said it was nice to see, as a father of daughters. And oh my gosh, it was as if I had cut the head off of a goat, put it on the altar, and asked the people to pray to it. And again, I think that there are things in common grace and more. There are right things that I've been critical of President Trump. There are right things President Trump did. I was vocally supportive of many things President Trump did. There have been right things President Biden's done. I've been supportive of some of those things. But it's interesting. You just get hammered by some of the people that agree with you. And so is the best thing just to not say anything? So I'm bringing you back to my question, because you're a public commentator. You're trying to balance that out. I'm the pastor of First Presbyterian Church of so-and-so. Is it different for me?
I think it is based on calling. I think that's a really great question. And that's a question that a pastor has to ask themselves. And you're right. Like if you feel like a calling to write and to speak on these things, that's good. But most people aren't. And I do think it's something to ask ourselves. Do I have to comment on every news story? I don't think so. Unless you feel like here's a big cultural moment where I'm going to comment because my people in my church really need to know what I think about it, and I can flesh it out this way. But think about this, Ed. 20 years ago, I didn't know what some random pastor 5 states away thought about every global crisis.
Right.
Nor did I care. And now it's like every time there's a news story, everyone has to comment. So I think we have to weigh that. James 1:19, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, really applies to the digital age.
It seems to be like so many people now that are highly destructive online. Their behavior is really hurtful, and a lot of them are inside the church. What are your thoughts around when Christians behave badly online, and then to the pastor who their church member is very destructive online? How do you coach them to confront and to really lead well those church members?
Well, I think there's 2 things there. I think from a broad level, we pastors, and I pastored for 6 years, and I'm involved in church life. We have to do, I think, a better job at equipping our people on how to live in a digital age. This is the age our people are called to live in as Christians. And I think we need to really give them tools in terms of what it looks like to conduct themselves, and let them know the fruits of the Spirit still matter online. All the sins of the tongue and all the sins of that we can commit against each other rhetorically, they're outlined in Scripture, still matter and count online. Proverbs still applies online. So I think we need to give our people tools and actually have them ask themselves questions like, what am I doing when I'm online? What's my purpose here? How is this forming and shaping me? From a broad perspective, we need to help our people do that. I think to answer your specific question, I do think there's a place for church leaders. And again, this has to be done with wisdom and care, and you have to know the local situation. But I think there is a place for pastors and leaders to pull aside a member who is just really being very toxic, or going after people, or slandering, spreading lies and half truths, to say, I love you, brother, or I love you, sister, but the way that you're acting online, we have some concerns about. Walk through Scripture and say, is this something that, as a follower of Christ, this is something that we should be doing. And again, we have to be careful about this. Just because someone has an opinion doesn't necessarily mean they're sinning online. I mean, even if they have a wrong opinion. But I do think there is a point of confrontation for someone who's being really toxic, who's going after other believers in a harmful way. I've had to, confront people that were spreading lies and posting stuff about organizations I work for, and just said, hey, this isn't true, and I don't think you should be posting that. So it's a delicate situation, but I do think there's a place for that.
Yeah, delicate. I mean, is probably the right word to put it. But I also think that two things I really found helpful in A Way with Words, using online conversations for good, your book, is the call to do better. And I think too, you even reminded us a minute ago, I think pastors and churches need to be teaching and preaching on this. I mean, people spend hours upon hours online. And I think we need to bring that online engagement under the lordship of Jesus Christ, really, and I think in the accountable community with one another. So, for me, as someone who serves, sometimes I transitioned from a church where I was the interim, and somebody was watching the live stream of the new pastor. Since I've done this 3 or 4 times, you can't figure out who it is, and they were just being critical. Oh, I really don't like this person. And actually, in this case, they said something positive about me and negative about the new pastor. And so I just was on the chat and I said, hey, why don't you just go ahead and keep praying and being encouraging for the new pastor? Of course, they immediately deleted their comment just because I replied to it. But who in the world says that? I mean, would we blurt this in church? Yet something about the disembodied nature of online communication causes that. And another situation, different person, this was actually at Moody Church. I actually encouraged a small group leader, so women's small group leader in this case, and to reach out to a person in the small group and just talk to them about, these online posts I just don't think are helpful. And the person received it. And I was so thankful that the person received it, and the Lord was honored by it. And they just, for them, what they literally said is, well, I didn't think anybody read it. Well, which is a fascinating thing. I mean, it's social media. It's not your diary. It's social media.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. But here's the thing. Not everyone likes to receive a critique of their social media. It's like, well, I could say anything I want. I'm in a free country, whatever it may be. So how would you encourage? Well, one thing is, let me just say, you could give away with words to somebody. But
Yes.
How would you encourage that pastor or church leader, in addition to giving away with words, to approach somebody or have somebody approach somebody? What would be? You've been a pastor, you until just recently serving that role, will probably again. How do you nudge that conversation along?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it is dependent on the kind of capital you have with somebody. And one of the things I try to tell people is the quality of our offline life will determine the quality of our online life. So if you have a healthy offline life, healthy accountability, people in your life who can confront you, that can shape your online life. One of the things, one of my sort of rules is that when someone's acting really crazy online, like going just insane and tweeting or posting stuff that's just berserk or nasty or mean, I'm really nervous, and I want to ask the question, what is going on offline? Something's going on in their life, because it seems like online engagement in some ways can be an escape or a fig leaf for some things that are going on offline. But in terms of confronting someone, I think if you have a relationship with them, I think it's okay to say, look, man, I really appreciate your ministry. I love what you're doing. Some of the ways that you engage online, I know you don't mean to do it this way. I don't think you mean for this, but this is kind of how it's being received. This is how it's being heard. This is what people take from that. I think most people will come away from that and say, man, I didn't even realize that. Ed, you did that to me a few years ago. You texted me a few of my tweets and you said, man, this is like a little bit over the top or whatever. And it really set me back. I was like, he's right. Because I think everybody down deep knows, am I doing this right? Or am I going too far online? And if someone could come and say, man, I just don't think the way you did that was good. Most people will receive that. Now, there are always people that, like Proverbs calls it, are fool that don't take instruction. And then obviously there's a deeper problem there. But I think as brothers and sisters, Bible says to provoke each other to love and good works. I think that's part of it. The online space is not some separate sphere that is exempt from all these rules of biblical discipleship.
Good.
I may have received a few texts from Ed from time to time too.
about
Ed,
social media.
Ed and the
Well,
Holy Spirit.
but I would say in both cases, in both received it well
Mhm.
and didn't necessarily agree. But I think that's a key thing. And part of the reason is because people have texted me about my social
Sure.
media. I was like, you know what? Probably not the best. So yeah.
Yeah, I love to dig into that because for church leaders, they're leading staff and or an organization, and a staff member's online personality can reflect the organization. So Dan, like wisdom to executive leaders. I mean, do you make policies about what staff can
That's good.
post?
That's good.
Or do you just, neglect and ignore the fact that, the staff have free reign and they can post whatever? So any advice around that?
See, I think staff, you can have policies. Now, every staff's going to want to do that a little differently, and some will have more freedom and some will have less. Depends on the nature of your organization. But I do think it's really good to have employee policies on that. Some employees will find that stifling. I think a lot of employees will find that comforting to say, okay, this just gives me the parameters that I can swim in. I think especially for churches, and one of the things I think about churches is that, we've said for 20 years that the website is the front door of a church now, right? Instead of the lobby, it's the website and possibly the pastor's sermons, right? Those are the first engagement you have with the church to kind of judge them. I also think the staff social media, particularly the senior pastor, is a front door, because a lot of times folks will go online and say, oh, let me see this guy. Sometimes they're not online at all, which is great, sometimes refreshing. But if you go online and you see the pastor and he's ranting and raving all the time and he's out of control, I think it's a turnoff. I think it can hurt people from coming in the front door. I think if you work for an organization, in some way you're representing them, right? So you think, well, I'm just the children's director, I'm just the worship leader. If you have that organization in your bio, you're representing them in some way. And, we're not individual people, we're part of a community. And I think we have to think about that.
Yeah, and I would be of the view that even if you don't have the organization's name in your
Mhm.
bio, you're still representing the organization. And a little tricky for me because I was in charge of our social media at Lifeway, and we had I think at that time there were, over the course of a year, 7,000 employees who got a W-2 or whatever from Lifeway, and I got to tell you, I wasn't the social media police. People had a broad ability to express their opinions. But there are some things you just don't want people to be, things that are contrary to the scriptures or things that are mean or wrong. I mean, and so I do think that a lot of pastors are sort of struggling. And this is a conversation I had just last week, and one of the pastors at this meeting said, "Well, I think people can post what they want in social media. We can't tell them not to." And I said, "Actually, you can. The question is how might you respond to that? What are the consequences? Is it we want to talk about this and let's do differently, or how we're going to represent ourselves, or is it a separation, which it can be? People have lost their jobs because of social media. So, all right, with all that being said, there are some obvious mistakes and things that people want to avoid, maybe even some not so obvious mistakes. Because one of the things I've encouraged pastor church leaders to do is to have a social media discussion with their staff to actually say, this is what's good. Don't become a distraction by taking us off mission in this way. I actually have a little protocol that I've used. So what are some mistakes that you see that pastors can communicate to people, or maybe themselves can avoid making when it comes to social media? Obvious or not so obvious mistakes?
Well, I think there's a few. I think one, even when we do talk about cultural and political issues, again, as I said, not making it personal. So you can speak out on issues. If that's, obviously allowable under your church's social media guidelines or your organizations, speak out on issues, but just understand always when you're doing that, you're representing not just you, but the organization. So I think that one is really important. I think number two, trying to resolve conflict online, interpersonal conflict that's within the organization. I see this happen from time to time, and I just think it's a bad look. So if you're having an issue within the organization, resolve that internally, resolve that not in public. I also see something too. I don't know if you noticed this, but got to be very careful that we don't put off the idea that the people we're representing as leaders that we're embarrassed by them. So sometimes I see folks who work for evangelical organizations kind of do a lot of this sort of, can you believe evangelicals are so whatever, or the kind of constant, and it's like, man, those people pay your paychecks. And so I be very careful in that sense as well. Being overly nasty and argumentative, going really deep on an argument back and forth over really ridiculous things, to where people come away and say, man, like, this is not a good look for that organization to be doing that. So I think those are some common mistakes people make. If you're a worship leader at a church, you think, I'm just the worship leader. But man, you can embarrass your whole church online. Or if you're a staff member at a Christian organization, you can embarrass your organization. Or even taking political positions that are really far out there, right or left, that might be at odds with where the people you represent are, or you're maybe putting your organization in a position of having to take a position on that when they really don't, or that's out of their lane. So I think those are all things you have to think about. I mean, one rule I always had was like, don't commit the organization to a political position they haven't thought through yet. You know what I'm saying? Or to a policy position. Anyways, so those are just some things I think about.
For the pastor that's thinking through this, and they really want to obviously bring in a biblical perspective. Maybe they're even developing a teaching series around how to engage. Like, what are the key biblical themes, key texts that you would suggest that they would use?
On a series on social media and technology.
Yep, absolutely.
See, I would do a broad sweep. I would do a series on this. First of all, I would start with creation, that understand and lay out for people what technology is and what it isn't. We think technology is a laptop or a microphone or an iPhone, but really technology is just the act of taking the raw materials of creation and innovating. It's fulfilling the creation mandate that way. And then I would talk about how technology can be corrupted in a fallen world, asking ourselves, what is it doing to us? Not just what we're doing with it. And then also going through, I think would be really important to go through, especially some of the Proverbs and then some of the New Testament passages about what we do with our words. I think we sometimes compartmentalize and think, yeah, I would never say this to someone in person, but man, when I'm online, it's okay. And the Bible has a lot to say about what we say, and a lot to say about the shape of our words, and walking through that. And then I would talk about, I think there's a temptation in the digital age, because we have the phone at our fingertips. And I got this, I'm borrowing this from Jen Michelle, who's a great writer who lives in Toronto, who's written a few books, but she talks about how one of the first temptations of Eve was that you can be all knowing. And that's the temptation of the internet age, that I have this thing in my pocket and I can be all knowing. And really, we're not made as humans to be all knowing. We're made, only God was. We're finite beings. And so having people discern between what is a good pursuit of knowledge, the Bible talks about the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom is good, and what is kind of frivolous pursuit of sort of junk food information, being a busybody, as Paul says in the New Testament. And then the last thing I would say, I would go through the passages in the pastorals about Christian leadership. It's interesting to me when we talk about Christian leadership, and Ed, you and I have talked about this before, we typically look at the two that are the biggest. Can they preach? Can they teach? And then are they faithful to their wives? And both of those are important. But there's a whole lot of other character traits too. And those are all traits of temperament, not a quarreler, not a brawler, kind. I think leaders can be disqualified if they are jerks, if they act terrible online, or even in their, in their leadership. And sometimes we overlook those traits of temperament, and I don't think we should.
Let's talk a little bit about the war on winsome, as I'm calling it. You've written, I would say, 2 books in the winsome space, if I could use the word winsome space. Certainly Christians in the Age of Outrage book I wrote is in the winsome space.
Yes.
Yet, we're hearing a lot of Christian leaders say, or maybe, I don't know if lot's the right word, some Christian leaders saying,
Hmm.
that's kind of a strategy of the past. We live in a world now. We got to punch harder. We got to punch back to the left, and we got to maybe fight our way forward. And having a and I don't want to. I am oversimplifying, but I would say there's a war on winsome. That word, if you were to tweet right now, Dan Darling said, I think we need to be winsome as Christians. You'd get 50 responses saying, not anymore. So how do you respond to that? How should we think as pastors and church leaders about winsome words online and beyond?
Yeah, the war on winsome is like the war of 2022. Um, I think on the one hand, there is a point to be made that we are in an age where there's increasing hostility to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. And so it's wise to be aware, to know that simply being kind and being nice and being thoughtful will not always gain us an audience that maybe it would have a generation ago. So I think there's something to be said there. On the other hand, when I look at the New Testament and I look at all the exhortations toward the fruits of the Spirit, these were written by men who were sent to jail for preaching, right? Paul is writing to Timothy from prison saying, yes, Timothy, fight for the things that matter. Be courageous. Stand up for what you believe. Jude is saying earnestly contend for the faith. And yet Paul is also saying, don't be a quarreler. Don't be a brawler. Be kind, be humble, understand that you are sinners saved by grace. Paul, before he tells Timothy to stand up against false teaching, make sure Timothy understands, humility and all that kind of thing. And Paul is saying that, this is the Apostle Paul saying this. And he's no shrinking violet. And then you think about Peter. Peter says, have an answer for every person for the hope that lies within you, but do it with gentleness and kindness. And this is Peter, the apostle, who said, I'll obey God rather than man, went to jail. He's the one that was willing to, pull out a sword and cut off the guy's ear, for heaven's sake. So I just think it's funny that we think somehow we're more courageous than Peter and Paul because we had a really strongly worded tweet. That somehow, yes, the apostles said to be kind and winsome and courageous and show the fruits of the Spirit, but those guys don't know the era we're in. I mean, are we in an era that's harder to live as a Christian than the first century Christians? I don't think so. I mean, so I just think it's really kind of a false choice, between civility and courage. I think we can do both of those at the same time.
So many of pastors and church leaders are dealing with their church members finding wrong sources of information online. And that, sometimes that comes from Christian sources, whether it's a discernment blogger or whatever. And what is your advice to church leaders around helping church members better discern sources of information?
Well, that's such a great question, because that's the question of the hour, right? There's so much information coming at us from, we're in an age where information is deregulated. There's good and bad things. The good thing is, you don't have the same three news organizations controlling the information. I think it's also good for marginalized voices now have a chance to speak. But at the same time, there's so much information and there's so many sources. How do we know what's right and true? I do think we need to teach our people discernment on the one hand of discernment is basically choosing between what is good and beautiful and true and what is not. At the same, but we also have to be discerning about discernment blogs, because I think a lot of those that are sort of self-appointed watchdogs, I don't think they're the people that are earnestly searching the scriptures. I think what they are the people Paul talks about. Mark those who are divisive among you. I think if there's a prurient interest in tabloid fodder among Christians, that to me is troublesome. This sort of, looking for ways and areas to tear people down. No, look, we need accountability. We need people in public positions need accountability. We've seen scandal. It's good that that's all been exposed. We need that. And yet I think this sort of delight in sort of taking people down is really wrong. I also think we just, as Christians, we're about the truth. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If we care about the truth, we should care about the truth about each other and make sure, are we getting have we done our homework? Asking ourselves, is this true? Is this actually true? Or is it half true? Am I getting the whole story? The love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, one of the marks of love for a brother or sister is love believes all things. In other words, love gives the benefit of the doubt. Now, we shouldn't be naive, right? There are bad people. There are scandals. There are Christians that do wrong things, but we should give Christians the benefit of the doubt to think, okay, Tim Keller said this. I'm not going to assume malice on his part based on one tweet that I misread. Let me give him the benefit of the doubt. Or Ed Stetzer said this. I'm not going to assume malice on his part. Let me give him the benefit of the doubt instead of just running with this sort of, he's a false prophet or he's a whatever. I just don't think that's healthy. It's not the way of love. It's not the way of Christ. We do need public confrontation. I mean, there are times where Christian leaders fall into heresy or have false teaching. That has to be confronted. But I think a lot of times what passes for watch bloggers and discernment blogs and all that stuff is really just sort of the Christian version of tabloid, like walking in the supermarket aisle and seeing those trashy tabloids. And I think we should avoid that. I think Paul is saying that to his young proteges there in the pastoral epistles.
Yeah, as we're wrapping up here, Dan, just not asking you to predict the future, but as you're thinking about the future of the church, like, what do you think the online conversations, where we're trending, what's your hope? What would you like to see happen here?
Well, it's hard to predict where it's all going to go. I don't think we're going to put the toothpaste back in the tube. I mean, I think the online community is here to stay, for good or ill. I am always positive, though. I'm a glass half full guy, and I do think, in spite of all the division and disunity that we see, that is very disheartening and I think hurts our mission. I do think God is at work in the world, and I think Christ is building his church even in this age. And if we're willing to look and see what the Spirit is doing, and I think it's easy for us to become cynical. We see the scandals, we see the bad headlines, we see the nastiness online. But then what happens? I go to church and I talk to local Christians in my church, and I realize they don't know the last 15 controversies that happened online. They're just faithfully serving in their communities, putting their yes on the table, trying to raise their families for the Lord. And so that's what gives me hope, that the kingdom of God is built mostly with ordinary people. There's a few of us that have books and headlines and bylines and podcasts and all that. And that's great. I'm grateful for that. But for the most part, the kingdom of God is built with ordinary people that, will never be known outside of their local community. And that's what sort of gives me hope for the future of the church.
That's a good word. You've been listening to Dan Darling. Be sure to check out his book, Away with Words, Using Our Online Conversations for Good. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review that help other ministry leaders find and benefit from our content more easily. We'll see you in the next episode.